The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, but the forest still dripped with it, each leaf heavy and dark, releasing water in slow, deliberate drops that echoed through the silence like a clock counting hours. No one was watching. Robert Mitchell stood on the porch of his cabin with a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands, watching the mist rise from the saturated ground in pale ribbons that twisted between the pine trunks before dissolving into nothing. The air carried that particular scent of Mississippi mornings after a storm, wet bark and red clay, when the earth seems to exhale everything it has been holding. He was 52 years old. His face bore the weathering of a man who had spent decades outdoors, lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth, not from laughter but from squinting into distances most people never bothered to look toward. His hair, more gray than brown now, was cut military short, a habit from 2 decades in the Marines that he had never shaken and never wanted to. Faded jeans and a green flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows made up his uniform, the dress code of a man who no longer cared about appearances, but still maintained a certain discipline about the basics. The cabin behind him was small, one room with a loft, Spartan in its furnishing. A narrow bed made with hospital corners, a wooden table with 2 chairs, though only one ever got used, a wood stove that kept the place warm through winter. On the single shelf above the bed sat a photograph in a simple frame, the only personal item visible in the entire space. Sarah Mitchell, his wife, smiling at the camera with wind in her hair. The photo had been taken on their honeymoon 24 years ago in the Blue Ridge Mountains. She had died of cancer 4 years back, and Rob had stopped decorating his life after that. He finished the coffee in 2 long swallows, rinsed the cup in the sink, and set it upside down on the drain board to dry. The motion was automatic, precise, the same every morning. There was comfort in routine, in the small rituals that gave shape to days that otherwise threatened to blur into one endless stretch of nothing. He pulled on his work boots, laced them tight, and reached for the heavy canvas jacket hanging by the door. The patch on the sleeve read United States Forest Service, Park Ranger, and beneath it, his name. Outside, his dog waited. Bear was a German shepherd, 4 years old, with the alert, intelligent eyes of a working animal. Rob had gotten him from a veteran service dog program 2 years ago, after the nightmares from Afghanistan got bad enough that he stopped sleeping more than 3 hours a night. Bear wasn't a therapy dog in any official sense, but he understood things. He knew when Rob needed to move, needed to get out of his own head. This morning the dog sat near the truck, tail sweeping the wet ground in a slow rhythm, watching his master with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. Rob opened the truck door and Bear jumped into the passenger seat without prompting. They had done this route 100 times, maybe more. The Pinehurst National Forest covered 60,000 acres of Mississippi wilderness, mostly pine and oak, with ravines and hollows where the land dipped and folded into itself like an old quilt. Rob's job was to patrol the trails, check for damage after storms, make sure hikers stayed on designated paths and didn't leave trash or start fires in restricted areas. It was quiet work, solitary, and that suited him fine. He drove slowly down the dirt road that led from his cabin to the main trail system, the truck's tires hissing through puddles, the wipers clearing a slow arc across the windshield. The forest on either side stood thick and dripping, the underbrush heavy with moisture, everything a deep, saturated green that seemed almost black in the early light. There was no one else out here. The storm had been severe enough to keep the usual morning hikers at home, and the parking lot at the trailhead was empty except for a single crow picking at something near the trash cans. Rob parked, stepped out, and stood for a moment, just listening. The forest had its own language if you knew how to hear it. The drip of water from high branches, the distant call of a woodpecker, sharp and rhythmic, the rustle of something small moving through the underbrush, probably a squirrel or a possum, wind moving through the canopy, making the pines sway and creak. He had learned to read these sounds in the Marines, in the mountains of Afghanistan, where listening meant the difference between going home and going home in a box. The skill had stayed with him. Bear jumped down from the truck and immediately put his nose to the ground, working in a tight circle, cataloging scents. Rob pulled a trail map from his jacket pocket, unfolded it, and studied the routes. The main loop was 5 miles, well maintained, with markers every quarter mile. But there were smaller offshoots, unofficial paths made by deer or by hikers who ignored the rules. And these were the ones that often caused problems. After a storm like last night's, there could be fallen trees, washed out sections, sinkholes where the ground had given way. He chose the northern trail, the one that ran along the ridge above Copperhead Ravine. It was narrow and rocky, prone to erosion, and he wanted to check it before the weekend when the hikers would return in numbers. He folded the map, tucked it back into his pocket, and started walking. Bear ranged ahead, nose down, tail up, moving with the easy confidence of an animal in its element. The trail was worse than he had expected. Water had carved new channels through the packed dirt, exposing roots and stones. In two places, small trees had come down, their shallow root systems unable to hold in the saturated soil. Rob made mental notes, marking GPS coordinates on his phone so he could send a crew out later to clear the debris. The work was methodical, familiar, and his mind drifted as he walked. Sarah crossed his thoughts, as she did most days, though the sharp edge of grief had dulled into something more like a constant, low ache, the kind you learn to live with. She had been a teacher, second grade, and she had loved her job with a fierce, uncomplicated joy that Rob had always envied. He had spent his 20s and 30s in the military, deploying to places where joy was a luxury no one could afford, and when he came home, he found that he had forgotten how to feel it. Sarah had been patient with him. She had understood that some things take time to heal, and some things never heal at all. They just become part of who you are. When she got sick, he had taken early retirement from the Marines to care for her. The last year of her life had been hard, filled with hospitals and treatments that stopped working and conversations about things neither of them wanted to talk about. When she finally died on a Tuesday morning in October with sun coming through the hospital window, he had felt a relief so profound it shamed him. Relief that her suffering was over. Relief that his was too, in a way. But then came the silence, the enormous, crushing silence of a house that no longer had her in it. And he realized that suffering, at least, had given him something to do. He had drifted for a while after that, sold the house in town, moved out to the cabin, took the ranger job because it was outside, because it kept him moving, because it required nothing of him except to show up and walk and notice things. And for 4 years, that had been enough. Not good, but enough. Bear barked, a sharp, urgent sound that cut through the rhythm of dripping water and creaking branches. Rob stopped, looked up. The dog was 30 yards ahead, off the trail, standing at the edge of the ravine with his body rigid, tail straight out. He barked again, then looked back at Rob, and there was something in his posture that Rob recognized. Alert, insistent. Something was wrong. Rob moved toward him, stepping carefully on the slick ground. The ravine was steep, dropping away sharply into a tangle of brush and exposed rock. Normally you could see the bottom, but the undergrowth was thick this time of year, and the rain had made everything wild and overgrown. Bear stood at the very edge, looking down, and when Rob reached him, the dog whined softly, a sound he almost never made. Rob knelt, put a hand on Bear's head, and followed the dog's gaze. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the slope, the rocks, the wet leaves. But then his eye caught something that didn't belong. A straight line where there should have been curves, a right angle where nature didn't make right angles. He stared, and slowly his brain began to parse what he was seeing. Stone, a wall of stacked stone partially buried in the hillside with mortar crumbling between the blocks. And beside it, almost completely hidden by mud and roots, the corner of a wooden frame, a door frame. Rob sat back on his heels, frowning. He had patrolled this area for 2 years and had never seen this, never even suspected it was there. The landslide from the storm must have washed away enough soil to expose it, revealing something that had been hidden for God knew how long. He stood, moved a few feet to the left to get a better angle, and saw more. The peak of a roof, or what had been a roof, now collapsed inward and covered with earth and vegetation. A chimney brick rising from the ground like a broken tooth. This was not a natural formation. This was a structure, a building, and someone had buried it, or time had buried it, and it had waited here in the dark until last night's rain decided to give it back to the world. Bear barked again, softer this time, almost questioning. Rob looked at him. The dog's ears were forward, his body tense but not aggressive, curious, maybe a little afraid. Rob said, "Stay." The command was automatic, a reflex from years of training, but even as he said it, he knew he was going down there. He could call it in, let someone else deal with it. That would be the smart thing, the safe thing. But standing here, looking at those stones, he felt something stir inside him that he had not felt in a long time. Not curiosity exactly, more like recognition. The sense that this mattered, that whatever was down there had been waiting, and now it was his job to find out why. He tested the slope with one boot, felt it slide a little under his weight. The ground was slick, treacherous. He would need to be careful. He glanced back at Bear, who watched him with eyes that seemed to say, "Are you sure about this?" Rob was not sure, but he was going anyway. The descent was slow and awkward. He half slid, half climbed, grabbing at roots and rocks for balance, the wet earth smearing across his jeans and jacket. Twice he nearly lost his footing and had to catch himself on a sapling that bent dangerously under his weight. Above him, Bear paced at the edge of the ravine, whining. When Rob reached the bottom, he stood in a narrow space between the slope and the exposed wall. Up close, the structure was more apparent. The stones were rough cut, the kind quarried locally a century ago. The mortar was old, lime-based, crumbling in places but still holding in others. The wall extended maybe 12 feet across before disappearing back into the hillside, and at the center was a door, wooden, hand-hewn, held together by square nails that had rusted to a deep orange-brown. There was no handle, just a hole where a handle had once been. Rob put his fingers through the hole and pulled. The door resisted, swollen from moisture, and for a moment he thought it would not open. Then, with a groan of old wood, it shifted inward an inch, then two, releasing a breath of air that smelled of damp stone and rust, and something older, something that had been sealed away from light for a very long time. Rob stepped back, his heart beating faster than it should have been. This was not his area. This was archaeology, history, something that required experts and permits and careful documentation. He should stop. He should back away, climb up, make the call. But the door was open now, just a crack, and through that crack came a darkness so complete it seemed almost solid. Rob pulled his flashlight from his belt, a heavy mag light that he carried on every patrol, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended in the still air. He pushed the door wider. It scraped against the stone floor, loud in the silence, and then he was looking into a single room, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with walls of stacked stone and a ceiling of rough timber beams. The floor was dirt, covered in a thick layer of leaves and debris that must have blown in over the years through cracks in the walls. In one corner stood the remains of a small fireplace, its bricks blackened with old soot. Against the far wall was a wooden shelf, sagging and rotted, and on the wall opposite the door, illuminated now by his flashlight, were marks. Rob stepped inside. The air was cool, almost cold, and utterly still, as if the room had been holding its breath. He moved the flashlight beam across the walls, taking in details. The shelf had once held something, jars maybe, or tools, but whatever had been there was long gone. The fireplace looked functional, built with care, with a chimney that rose through the ceiling and presumably up through the earth above. This was not a temporary shelter. Someone had built this to last. And then there were the marks. Rob crossed to the wall, crouched, and examined them more closely. They were scratches, carved into the stone with something sharp, a knife or a nail. Vertical lines grouped in sets of 5, the way prisoners mark time in movies. He counted them. 20 groups. No, more. 30, 40. He kept counting, moving the flashlight beam along the wall. 60 groups, 70. And then, near the end, the lines became more erratic, less carefully grouped, as if whoever was making them had grown tired or desperate or both. 127 marks. Someone had been here for 127 days, counting, waiting. Rob stood slowly, his knees protesting. His throat felt tight. He did not know why this affected him so much, this evidence of long ago suffering, but it did. Maybe because he understood it. The need to mark time, to prove to yourself that you were still here, still breathing, still counting. He had done the same thing in Afghanistan, in his head, if not on walls. Day 1 went on, day 2, day 50, counting until he could go home. He swept the flashlight around the room again, more carefully this time. In the corner near the fireplace, he saw something he had missed before. The floorboards there, and yes, parts of the dirt floor had been covered with rough planks, were slightly raised as if something lay beneath them. He moved closer, knelt, and ran his fingers along the edge of one board. It was loose. He worked his fingers underneath and lifted. The board came up with surprising ease, and beneath it was a shallow depression, maybe 6 inches deep, lined with stones. And in that depression, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow stayed mostly intact, was a metal box. Rob lifted it out carefully. It was an ammunition box, military issue, the kind used in World War II, made of heavy steel and painted olive drab. The paint was flaking and rust had eaten into the corners, but the box was intact. He set it on the floor beside him and stared at it for a long moment. This was evidence. This was someone's property. He should not open it. He should document it, photograph it, call the proper authorities. But his hands were already moving, already working the rusted latch, and he told himself it was just to make sure the contents were safe, not damaged by moisture. He told himself he would close it right back up if it was empty or if it contained something that clearly belonged to someone else. The latch gave with a metallic click. Rob lifted the lid. Inside, protected by layers of oilcloth, were papers, letters, maybe 8 or 10 of them, folded and tied together with string that had rotted almost to nothing. And beneath the letters, a small wooden box, no bigger than a deck of cards, and a tarnished metal chain with something attached to it. Rob's hands were shaking slightly as he lifted out the bundle of letters. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and the ink had faded to a pale brown, but the handwriting was still legible. Careful, looping cursive, the kind taught in schools decades ago. He untied the string, which fell apart at his touch, and unfolded the first letter. The paper crackled softly. At the top, in that same careful script, was a date, June 14th, 1951, and below it, 2 words, Dearest Joe. Rob sat back against the stone wall, the letter in his hands, and began to read. Dearest Joe, the letter began, the baby is doing well. She loves it here, loves the trees and the quiet. Every morning she runs outside and laughs at the birds. I know you are working so hard to provide for us, and we are grateful. This little house is perfect for now. Come home safe, my love. Your Ruth. The letter was short, just a few lines, but the tenderness in it was palpable. Rob could picture the woman who wrote it, young, hopeful, writing to her husband who was away working. A simple domestic scene from 70 years ago, preserved in ink and paper. He set the first letter aside and picked up the second. January 19th, 1952. Dearest Joe, the winter has been cold, but we are managing. Clara asks for you every day. I tell her you will be home soon. The men came by again last night. I kept her quiet like you said. I trust you, Joe, but I am frightened. How much longer must we stay here? Your Ruth. The tone had shifted. Fear had crept into the words. Men came by, kept her quiet. Something was wrong. He read faster now, unfolding the next letter, then the next. March 10th, 1953. Joe, our home is gone. They burned it. I took Clara and we ran. We are where you said to go, the place you built. She is safe. She asked for you. Please, please be safe. They are looking. Your Ruth. The handwriting was shakier here, the ink smudged in places as if tears had fallen on the page. Rob felt a cold understanding spreading through him. This woman, Ruth, and her daughter Clara had been hiding, running from someone, and this place, this buried room in the hillside, had been their refuge. He unfolded the next letter. May 3rd, 1953. Joe, it has been 38 days. I marked the wall so I do not forget. Clara is forgetting your face. I show her your picture, but she cries. When will you come? I am so tired. Your Ruth. 38 days. Rob looked at the marks on the wall again. 38 marks at the beginning of the count, and the letters continued, each one shorter, each one more desperate. May 20, 1953. Joe, I heard the explosion. Was it the mine? They are saying men are dead. Please tell me you are not among them. I wait. Your Ruth. And then, the final letter. The handwriting was barely legible, the lines slanting downward as if the writer had been too weak to hold the pen steady. To whoever finds this, my name is Ruth Harmon. My husband Joseph died in the mine on May 15, 1953. Our daughter Clara lives. If God wills it, give this to her. Tell her we loved her. Tell her we tried. Ruth Harmon, March 1954. Rob stared at the page. March 1954, almost a year after the husband died. Ruth had stayed here, or somewhere, long enough to write this final letter. And then what? Where had she gone? Where was Clara? He set the letters down carefully, almost reverently, and reached for the small wooden box. It opened with a soft creak, and inside was a locket, oval-shaped, made of tarnished silver. He pried it open and found a photograph inside, tiny, sepia-toned. A man in work clothes, broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and a slight smile. Beside him, a woman, young and pretty, with dark hair pinned up. And in front of them, held in the woman's arms, a little girl, maybe 3 or 4 years old, clutching a cloth doll. Rob turned the locket over. On the back, engraved in delicate script, were 3 words. Clara Harmon, 1952. His breath caught. This was them. This was the family. Joseph, Ruth, and Clara. And this tiny photograph, preserved in a locket, hidden in a box, buried under the floor of a forgotten room, was the last proof they had existed. He picked up Ruth's final letter again, read the last line. If God wills it, give this to her. She's still alive. Clara, Ruth had believed her daughter was still alive when she wrote on this. That was 1954, 71 years ago. If Clara had been 4 years old then, she would be 75 now. It was possible. She could still be alive. Rob sat in the darkness of that buried room, surrounded by the evidence of lives interrupted, of suffering endured in silence, and felt something shift inside him. For 4 years, he had been going through the motions, walking trails, checking maps, existing but not living. And now, holding these letters, looking at this photograph, he felt the first stirrings of purpose. Ruth Harmon had asked someone to find her daughter. She had hidden these letters, this photograph, this proof, and she had waited 70 years for someone to discover them. And now, by accident or fate, or the simple mechanics of a rainstorm washing away dirt, Rob had found them. Sarah's voice came to him then, not a hallucination but a memory, clear as the day she had spoken the words. Keep living, she had said in those final days, not just existing, living. And he had nodded and said yes, but he had not known how. He had not known what that meant. Until now he had a mission. Find Clara Harmon, tell her that her mother loved her, tell her what happened. Rob carefully placed the letters back in the box along with the locket and the photograph. He closed the lid, relatched it, and tucked it under his arm. Then he stood, took one last look around the room and walked back to the door. Outside, the rain had started again, a light drizzle that pattered on the leaves and made the air even heavier. Bear was still waiting at the top of the ravine, and when he saw Rob emerge, he barked once, sharp and relieved. Rob climbed back up, slower this time because he was carrying the box and did not want to drop it. His boots slipped on the wet earth, and once he nearly went down, but he caught himself and kept going. At the top, he stood for a moment, breathing hard, the box clutched against his chest. Bear nosed at it, curious, and Rob said, "Easy, boy." The dog sat, watching him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than they should. Rob looked back down at the structure, now barely visible again through the underbrush and the rain. Someone had built that place with care. Someone had hidden there, had counted days on the wall, had waited for a man who never came home. And someone, Ruth Harmon, had left a message in a bottle, trusting that eventually, somehow, it would be found. He turned and started walking back toward the truck, Bear at his side, the rain soaking through his jacket and dripping from the brim of his cap. His mind was already working, already planning. He would need to find records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, anything that could tell him what happened to Clara Harmon after 1954. He would need to search, to ask questions, to follow whatever trail still existed after 7 decades. It would not be easy. It might not even be possible, but he was going to try, because a dying woman had asked someone to, and he was that someone now. And because for the first time since Sarah died, he had a reason to wake up in the morning that was not just habit. Back at the truck, he placed the box carefully on the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel. Bear jumped into the back, shaking water from his coat. Rob sat there for a moment, engine off, looking at the box. Then he reached over, opened it one more time, and pulled out the photograph. Joseph, Ruth, and Clara Harmon. A family frozen in time, smiling for a camera 70 years ago, with no idea what was coming, no idea that their lives would be torn apart, that they would be forgotten, buried, erased. But they had not been erased, not completely, because Ruth had made sure of that. She had left proof, and now someone had found it. Rob carefully placed the photograph back in the box and closed the lid. Then he started the truck, put it in gear, and drove slowly back down the muddy road toward his cabin. The rain fell steadily now, washing the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it, and the forest on either side stood dark and dripping and full of secrets. But one secret had been revealed, and Rob was going to make sure it did not get buried again. Back at the cabin, the afternoon light was fading into that particular gray that comes before dusk. Rob set the ammunition box on his wooden table and stared at it for a long moment before making fresh coffee. The letters lay before him, each one a window into a world that had ended before he was born. He spread them out in chronological order, watching Ruth's handwriting transform from hopeful to desperate across the span of 2 years. Bear settled by the wood stove with a soft groan, his muzzle resting on his paws. The dog's eyes tracked Rob's movements, alert even in rest. Outside, the rain had turned to mist, and through the window, Rob could see the forest disappearing into twilight. He picked up the photograph again. The little girl, Clara, looked directly at the camera with an expression that was simultaneously shy and curious. What had happened to her after her mother wrote that final letter? Had she grown up knowing her parents' story, or had it been lost to time and trauma? Rob opened his laptop and began searching, typing variations of names and dates into search engines. Clara Harmon, Mississippi. Joseph Harmon Mine Disaster, 1953. Greenwood County Historical Records. The results were scattered and inconclusive, but they were a start. His phone sat on the table beside the computer. He picked it up, hesitated, then opened his contacts. Linda Torres, his supervisor. It was late on a Sunday, but this could not wait. Before he could talk himself out of it, he pressed call. Mitchell, Linda's voice was cautious. Everything all right? I found something, Rob said. In the forest, a structure, buried. There are letters inside from 1953. A family that went into hiding. The mother asked someone to find her daughter. Silence on the other end. Then Linda's voice, softer now. What do you need? Time, Rob said. I need to find this woman. If she's still alive, she deserves to know what happened to her parents. Another pause. Rob could hear the television in the background, voices from a news program. When Linda spoke again, there was something in her tone he had rarely heard. Warmth. You've got 2 weeks of personal time saved, she said. Use it, but document everything. And Rob, this is good work, the kind that matters. After they hung up, Rob sat in the gathering darkness, the letters spread before him like pieces of a puzzle. Somewhere out there, Clara Harmon might still be alive, might still be waiting without knowing she was waiting for the truth about her family. He would find her. He had made a promise to a woman who had been dead for 70 years, and he was going to keep it. For the first time since Sarah's death, Robert Mitchell felt the weight of the future instead of the past, and it felt surprisingly like hope. By mid-afternoon, the rain had stopped, though the sky remained the color of old pewter, heavy and low, pressing down on the forest like something waiting to break. Rob sat at his wooden table with the ammunition box open before him, the letters arranged in chronological order. Each one told a piece of Ruth Harmon's story, fragments of hope and fear written in fading ink. The single overhead bulb cast harsh yellow light across the pages, and outside, water continued its steady drip from the eaves, marking time. He had read through the letters 3 times now. With each pass, new details emerged, small observations that painted a fuller picture of what Ruth and Clara had endured. The early letters hummed with domestic contentment, small joys about a daughter's laughter and the beauty of pine trees. But as the dates progressed, fear crept into the words. The handwriting grew hurried. Sentences were crossed out, rewritten. By that final letter dated March 1954, the script barely held together, letters slanting downward as if the writer no longer had strength to hold the pen level. Bear lay near the wood stove, head resting on his paws, his attention never fully leaving Rob. The dog had been restless since their return from the forest, pacing the small cabin, nosing at the box, whining softly. Now he was still, but his ears tracked every movement Rob made, every shift in posture. Rob lifted the photograph again, the sepia image from inside the locket. Three people frozen in a moment that must have felt ordinary to them. Joseph Harmon stood tall, his hand resting on his wife's shoulder. Ruth held young Clara, who clutched a cloth doll and gazed at the camera with wide, curious eyes. The back of the photograph read Clara Harmon, 1952, which meant she would have been around 4 years old then. If she was still alive today in 2025, she would be in her late 70s, perhaps 76 or 77. The mathematics were simple enough. The question they raised was enormous. Where was she? What had happened after her mother wrote that final desperate letter? Had Ruth survived long enough to see her daughter grow? Or had something else happened in those months of hiding? The letters suggested desperation, people hunting them, a house burned, a husband dead in a mine explosion. But the story ended there abruptly with no resolution. Rob set the photograph down and reached for his laptop. The search bar blinked at him, cursor waiting. He typed Clara Harmon, Mississippi, 1950s, and got hundreds of results, none obviously connected to the woman he sought. He tried Clara Harmon, Greenwood County mine disaster, 1953. Fewer results this time, but still nothing concrete. Genealogy sites, census records behind paywalls, obituaries that might or might not be relevant. Frustration built in his chest. This was not his skill set. He could read terrain, track animals, fix broken equipment. He was not a detective. He did not know how to navigate the bureaucratic maze of public records and archived documents. But he knew someone who might. He scrolled through his phone contacts until he found Linda Torres, his supervisor. A woman in her early 60s with a sharp mind and no patience for bureaucracy that served no purpose. More importantly, she had been with the Forest Service for 30 years and knew everyone in the county who mattered. It was Sunday evening. Linda valued her weekends, but Rob pressed call anyway. She answered on the third ring. "Mitchell, this better be good." "It is," Rob said. He explained about the structure, the letters, the family that had disappeared into history. When he finished, there was a pause. He could hear a television in the background, voices from a sitcom. Then Linda sighed. "You know the protocol, Rob. Anything like that, you file a report and hand it over to the county archaeologist." "I know, but there's a woman, Clara Harmon. She was a child when her family went into hiding. Her mother left a letter asking someone to find her, to tell her what happened. I think she might still be alive." Another pause, longer this time. When Linda spoke again, her tone had changed, softer and more careful. "What are you asking me for, Rob? I need 2 weeks of a personal time. I need to find her. I need to finish this." Linda did not answer right away. Rob could picture her in her living room, weighing the request against regulations and common sense. Finally, she said, "You have the time saved. Take it. But you do this by the book. You document everything. And if you find something that belongs to someone, you give it back properly. Understood?" "Understood, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Linda said. "You might be chasing a ghost." The line went dead. Rob set the phone down and looked at Bear. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Rob allowed himself a faint smile. "All right, boy, let's get to work." The Greenwood County Courthouse was a red brick building in the center of town, 3 stories tall with white columns and a clock tower frozen at 3:15 for as long as anyone could remember. Rob parked his truck in the lot behind it and sat for a moment, gathering himself. Government buildings made him uneasy, reminded him too much of the military bureaucracy he had spent 2 decades navigating. But this was necessary. Inside, the air was cool and carried the scent of old paper and floor wax. The lobby stood empty except for a security guard who nodded at Rob as he passed through the metal detector. The county clerk's office was on the 2nd floor, down a hallway lined with photographs of former officials, all of them white men in dark suits with serious expressions. The clerk's office was small and cluttered. Filing cabinets lined the walls. Stacks of documents covered every available surface. Behind the counter sat a man in his 50s, thin and balding, with wire-rimmed glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked up when Rob entered, his expression one of mild annoyance at being interrupted. "Help you? I'm looking for property records from the 1950s. A family named Harmon lives somewhere near Greenwood." The clerk sighed and pushed his glasses up. "That's a long time ago. You got an address?" "Just the name. Joseph and Ruth Harmon. They had a daughter, Clara." The clerk frowned. "Property lot number? Tax ID? Anything more specific?" Rob shook his head. The clerk sighed again, louder this time, and turned to his computer. His fingers moved slowly over the keyboard, hunt and peck style. The monitor flickered with screens of data Rob could not decipher. Several minutes passed. The only sound was the clicking of keys and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Finally, the clerk stopped typing and leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Here, Joseph E. Harmon, purchased Lot 47 on Pine Hollow Road in 1951. Property condemned and seized in 1954 for unpaid taxes. Rob felt confirmation settle in his chest. This was them. Who seized it? The clerk clicked a few more keys. Greenwood Mining Company. Says here they held the lien. He looked up at Rob over the top of his glasses. That company's been defunct for decades. Shut down after the mine disaster in '53. What mine disaster? Rob asked, though he already knew the answer. You're not from around here, are you? Big cave-in at the Greenwood Quarry. 12 men killed. Company went bankrupt from the lawsuits and shut down 6 months later. He turned back to his computer. Says here Joseph E. Harmon was listed among the deceased. Rob's jaw tightened. Ruth's letter had mentioned an explosion. Men dead. Now he had confirmation. Joseph had died in the mine and his family had lost their home shortly after. What happened to the family, the wife and daughter? The clerk shrugged. Doesn't say. Once the property was seized, they're not in our records anymore. Rob thanked him and left, his mind already moving to the next step. If the county records held nothing about Ruth and Clara after 1954, he needed to look elsewhere. Social services, churches, schools. Somewhere in this town, there had to be a trail. Outside, the sky had darkened, and a light rain had begun to fall again, the kind of drizzle that soaked through clothing without seeming to. Rob pulled up his collar and walked back to his truck. As he reached for the door handle, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Heard you're looking into the Harmons. I can help. Martin Hayes. Rob stared at the screen. He did not know anyone named Martin Hayes. But if this person had information, he was willing to listen. He typed a quick reply. Who are you? The response came almost immediately. I knew Joe Harmon. Meet me at the diner on Route 12 tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. Rob stood in the rain, the phone in his hand. This could be nothing or it could be everything. He typed back, I'll be there. The diner was called Rosie's, a squat building with faded yellow siding and a neon sign that flickered in the gray morning light. Rob arrived 10 minutes early and took a booth near the back where he could see the door. The place carried the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee. A waitress with tired eyes brought him a cup without asking, setting it down with a clatter. He was halfway through the coffee when the door opened and an old man walked in. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, his body bent with the weight of 9 decades. White hair stood in a shock above a face carved deep with lines. He wore a denim jacket over a flannel shirt. His eyes, though, were sharp and clear, and they found Rob immediately. The old man made his way to the booth and slid into the seat across from Rob with a soft grunt. You Mitchell? I am. You're Martin Hayes. That's right. Martin raised a hand and the waitress appeared with another cup of coffee. He took a sip, grimaced, and set it down. Awful stuff, but it's warm. He looked at Rob with those sharp eyes. You found something out in the woods, didn't you? Something to do with Joe Harmon. Rob hesitated, then nodded. A structure, built into a hillside. Inside were letters from his wife, Ruth. I'm trying to find their daughter, Clara. Martin's expression shifted, something between sadness and relief. I wondered if anyone ever would. He looked down at his coffee, and for a moment Rob thought the old man might cry. But when Martin looked up again, his face was composed, steady. Joe was my friend, best man at my wedding. Saved my life once when a truck jack slipped. Good man, the best. What happened to him? Rob asked. Martin took another sip of coffee, grimaced again. You know about the mine disaster? Rob nodded. 1953, May 15th. We were working deep shaft, extracting limestone. Joe had been complaining for months about cracks in the support beams. Said the whole thing was going to come down. He reported it to the foreman, to the manager, even threatened to go to the federal inspectors. But the company didn't want to hear it. Production quotas, they said. We shut down for repairs, we lose money. Martin paused, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup. Joe kept pushing. He wouldn't let it go, and that made people nervous. One night his house burned down. Everyone knew it wasn't an accident. The company wanted him quiet. Rob felt a chill run through him, so he built the shelter. Yeah, took him about a month, working nights. Some of us helped, me included. We didn't ask questions. If Joe said his family needed a safe place, we believed him. He looked out the window, his eyes distant. Day of the collapse, I was supposed to be on shift, but I woke up sick, fever, couldn't hardly stand. Joe took my place. He told me later he knew something was going to happen that day. Said he felt it in his bones. But he went anyway, because if he didn't, someone else would die. What happened? Rob asked. Shaft collapsed around noon, 12 men underground. Rescue crews tried, but there was a secondary collapse that killed 3 of the rescuers. After that, they called it off. Declared everyone dead and sealed the mine. He looked at Rob, but Joe didn't die in the collapse. Rob's heart skipped. What do you mean? I was there when they pulled him out. He was alive, unconscious, beat to hell, but alive. They loaded him into an ambulance, and I thought, thank God he made it, but that ambulance didn't go to the hospital. Where did it go? Martin shook his head. I don't know. I tried to find out. Went to the hospital the next day. They had no record of him. Went to the company office. They told me he was dead, showed me a death certificate. But I know what I saw. Joe Harmon was alive when they took him away. Rob sat back, his mind racing. If Joe had survived the collapse, where had they taken him? And why would the company declare him dead? Unless they wanted him gone. Unless he knew too much and keeping him alive was a risk they could not take. What about Ruth and Clara? Rob asked. Do you know what happened to them? Martin nodded slowly. Ruth came looking for Joe a few days after the collapse. I told her what I saw, that he was alive. She didn't believe the company's story either, but there was nothing she could do. No money for lawyers, no connections. She took Clara and disappeared. I heard later they went to a church shelter, St. Luke's over in Millbrook. But after that, I don't know, I lost track. Rob felt pieces beginning to fall into place. Ruth had taken Clara to a shelter. Eventually she had written that final letter, asking someone to find her daughter. But what had happened between the shelter and that letter? And where was Clara now? There's one more thing, Martin said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He slid it across the table. Joe gave this to me a week before the collapse. Said if anything happened to him, I should keep it safe. I never knew what to do with it, so I kept it all these years. Rob unfolded the paper. It was a hand-drawn map, crude but detailed, showing the layout of the Greenwood quarry. Certain sections were marked with red X's. Beside them, in Joe's handwriting, were notes. Critical fracture, reported Feb 12. Ignored by management. Another note read, Foreman Cole refused to shut down. Said production comes first. At the bottom of the map, in larger letters, was a final message. If I don't make it, give this to Inspector Matthews, Federal Safety Board. Meridian covered up structural failure. 12 men will die unless someone acts. Rob looked up at Martin. Did you ever give this to anyone? Martin's face darkened with shame. No, I was a coward. I had a family, a mortgage. The company made it clear that anyone who talked would lose their job, maybe worse. So I kept quiet. I've lived with that guilt for 72 years. Rob folded the map carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. It's not too late. If Clara is still alive, she deserves to know the truth. Her father was a hero. He tried to save lives. Martin nodded, his eyes wet now. Find her. Tell her Joe Harmon was the best man I ever knew. Rob left the diner with more questions than answers, but also with a clearer picture. Joe Harmon had been a whistleblower, a man who stood up to corporate greed and paid for it. Or maybe not paid with his life, if Martin was right about seeing him alive after the collapse. Either way, Ruth and Clara had been collateral damage, forced into hiding, their lives upended by forces beyond their control. The next stop was St. Luke's Parish, a small white chapel on the outskirts of Millbrook, about 20 miles from Greenwood. Rob drove with the windows down, letting the cool air clear his head. The rain had stopped again, and sunlight broke through the clouds and scattered beams that made the wet pavement shine. St. Luke's was older than he expected. Peeling paint covered the clapboard siding. A wooden cross above the door tilted slightly to one side. The parking lot was empty except for a single car, a battered sedan that looked like it had not moved in weeks. Rob parked beside it and walked to the front door. It was unlocked. Inside, the chapel was small and dim, lit only by colored light filtering through stained glass windows. Wooden pews lined the center aisle. At the front, a simple altar held a brass cross and 2 candles. The air carried the scent of dust and old hymnals. A door to the side of the altar opened, and a man emerged, young, maybe in his mid-40s, wearing black slacks and a clerical collar. He smiled when he saw Rob. "Good morning, I'm Father Samuel Cooper. Can I help you?" Rob introduced himself and explained why he was there, carefully editing out details about the letters. He said only that he was researching a family who had stayed at the church shelter in the 1950s, the Harmons, and he was hoping to find records. Father Cooper's smile faded. The 1950s is a long time ago. Most of our records from that era were lost in a fire in the 70s. But we do have some guest logs in the basement. Let me check. He led Rob down a narrow staircase to a windowless room, lined with metal shelves. Cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly, labeled with years in faded marker. Father Cooper pulled down a box labeled 1950 to 1955 and set it on a folding table. "This might have something. Take your time." Rob opened the box and found a stack of ledgers bound in cracked leather. He flipped through them, scanning names and dates. Most entries were brief, just a name and arrival date. But near the back of the ledger for 1953, he found what he was looking for. March 18, 1953. Ruth Harmon and daughter Clara. Shelter assigned, room 3B. His heart beat faster. This was proof. They had been here. He scanned the rest of the page, looking for a departure date, but found none. The next entry was dated April 1953, a different family. He turned the page, then the next, searching for any other mention of the Harmons. And then, near the end of the ledger, he found it. March 1954. Ruth Harmon, deceased. Burial, County Cemetery. Daughter Clara transferred to family care, address withheld. Rob stared at the words. Ruth had died here, a year after arriving at the shelter. And Clara, at 7 years old, had been placed with a family. But the address was withheld, sealed by the state, probably to protect the child's privacy. He closed the ledger and stood. Clara had been placed with a family. That meant there would be records, foster care files, adoption papers, but those would be harder to access, protected by privacy laws. He would need help. Back upstairs, Father Cooper was waiting. "Did you find anything?" "Yes, thank you." Rob paused. "Do you know anything about what happened to the children who were placed from this shelter?" Father Cooper shook his head. "I'm sorry, I've only been here 5 years. The previous pastor might have known, but he passed away in 2018. Rob thanked him again and left. Outside, the sun was higher now and the day had turned warm. He sat in his truck and pulled out his phone. He needed someone who could navigate the bureaucracy of sealed records, someone with connections. Rebecca Hayes answered on the second ring. "Rob Mitchell, twice in 1 month. To what do I owe the honor?" Rebecca was a journalist with the Greenwood Tribune, someone Rob had worked with on a story about illegal logging in the National Forest a year ago. She was smart, tenacious, and knew how to get information out of reluctant sources. "I need a favor," Rob said. "I'm looking for someone. A woman, Clara Harmon, would be in her mid-70s now. She was placed in foster care in 1954 and the records are sealed. Can you help?" There was a pause. "Why are you looking for her?" Rob told her briefly about the letters, the buried house, Ruth's final request. When he finished, Rebecca was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "That's a hell of a story, Rob. Give me a day. I'll see what I can dig up." Rob thanked her and hung up. Then he sat in the parking lot of St. Luke's, watching the sunlight move across the chapel's white walls. Clara Harmon was out there somewhere, and he was getting closer. The call came the next evening. Rob was sitting on his porch, watching the sun set through the pines, when his phone buzzed. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen. "I found her," Rebecca said without preamble. "Clara Harmon. She was placed with a family named Harper in 1954. Married a man named David Harper in 1967. He died in 1998. She's still alive, living in Meridian, Mississippi. I've got an address." Rob's hand tightened around the phone. "Are you sure?" "Positive. I cross-referenced foster care records, marriage licenses, and property records. It's her, Rob. She's alive." Rob closed his eyes and let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. "Thank you." "What are you going to do?" Rebecca asked. "I'm going to find her," Rob said. "I'm going to give her back her family." The drive to Meridian took 40 minutes. Rob made it in 30, his foot heavier on the gas than usual. The address Rebecca had given him was on Magnolia Lane, a quiet street lined with modest single-story homes and old oak trees. Number 412 was a pale blue house with white trim, a front porch shaded by a magnolia tree, and a mailbox painted to look like a birdhouse. Rob parked at the curb and sat for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, his heart pounding harder than it had any right to. He reached for the ammunition box on the passenger seat, the box that held Ruth's letters and the photograph, and stepped out of the truck. Bear whined from the back seat, sensing his master's tension, but Rob said, "Stay, boy," and the dog obeyed. The walkway to the front porch was lined with flowers, carefully tended. The porch itself held a wicker chair and a small table with a glass of iced tea sitting on it, half finished. Rob climbed the steps, his boots loud on the wooden planks, and knocked on the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then he heard footsteps, slow and measured, and the door opened. The woman who stood there was small, maybe 5 feet tall, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple floral dress and glasses on a chain around her neck. Her eyes were gray, sharp, and curious, and they studied Rob with the kind of directness that comes from a lifetime of teaching children. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was clear, steady, with a faint southern accent. Rob swallowed. "Mrs. Harper, Clara Harper?" The woman's expression did not change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "That's me. Who are you?" Rob held up the box. "My name is Robert Mitchell. I'm a park ranger in Greenwood. I found something that belonged to your mother." Clara Harper went very still. Her hand, which had been resting on the doorframe, tightened until her knuckles turned white. "My mother?" she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. Rob nodded. He opened the box and pulled out the photograph, the small sepia image of Joseph, Ruth, and a little girl with a cloth doll. He held it out to her. Clara took it with shaking hands. She stared at it, her lips moving silently, and then she looked up at Rob, and her eyes were full of tears. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "From a house in the forest, a house your father built. Your mother left it there, along with letters. She asked someone to find you, to give this to you." Clara pressed the photograph to her chest and closed her eyes. A single tear ran down her cheek. "I thought everything was gone. I thought there was nothing left." Rob's throat was tight. "There's more. Can I come in?" Clara nodded and stepped back, opening the door wider. Rob followed her into a small, neat living room filled with sunlight. Family photographs covered the walls, children and grandchildren, but none older than a few decades. Clara sat in a chair by the window and gestured for Rob to sit across from her. He set the box on the coffee table between them. "Tell me," Clara said, "tell me everything." And so he did. He told her about the storm, the landslide, the buried house. He told her about the letters, about Ruth's words, about the tally marks on the wall. He told her about Martin Hayes and what had happened to her father, about the mine disaster and the company's cover-up. And as he spoke, Clara listened, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, the room was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. Clara reached out and opened the box, lifting out the letters one by one, running her fingers over her mother's handwriting. She read them slowly, taking her time, and Rob sat quietly, giving her space. Finally, she looked up. "I remember that house. I was so young, but I remember. The smell of it, the cold stone, my mother marking the wall every night. She told me we were safe there, that my father would come back." Her voice broke. "He never did." "He tried," Rob said. "He died trying to save other men. Your mother knew that. She wanted you to know it too." Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you for finding me, for keeping my mother's promise." Rob stood. "There's one more thing. The house is still there. Would you like to see it?" Clara looked at him, and for the first time since he had arrived, she smiled. "Yes, I would like that very much." Spring came to the Mississippi forest the way it always did, slowly at first and then all at once, the dogwoods exploding into white blooms overnight. The morning Clara Harper decided to return to the place of her childhood arrived with a sky so clear it looked like blue glass. Rob pulled up to her house just after 7, the truck freshly washed, Bear sitting alert in the back seat. He had spent a restless night, his mind turning over the magnitude of what was about to happen. For 71 years, Clara had lived with fragments of memory, half-remembered images of a time when her world fell apart. Today, she would walk back into that world and face what remained. She was waiting on the porch when he arrived, dressed in gray slacks and a cream-colored cardigan, her white hair pinned back with the same careful precision she brought to everything. In her hands, she held a small wooden box, polished and dark with age. When Rob stepped out of the truck, she descended the porch steps with surprising steadiness, refusing his offered arm. "I've been waiting 71 years for this," she said. "I can manage the stairs." Her daughter Sarah pulled into the driveway behind Rob's truck, stepping out with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder and concern written across her face. She was 48, tall and angular where her mother was small and rounded, with the protective intensity of someone who had spent a lifetime looking after others. "Mom, you don't have to do this," Sarah said, walking quickly toward them. "We can just keep the letters. That's enough." Clara turned to her daughter with an expression Rob had seen on the faces of drill sergeants and combat veterans, a look that said the decision was made and no amount of persuasion would change it. "I spent my whole life not knowing, not remembering clearly. Today I remember. Today I go home." Sarah looked at Rob, searching his face for reassurance. He gave a small nod. Some journeys had to be taken, regardless of the cost. They drove in convoy, Rob's truck leading, Sarah's sedan following close behind. The route took them north out of Meridian, through small towns that looked frozen in 1960, past fields where cotton had once grown, and now only kudzu held the earth together. Clara sat in the passenger seat of Rob's truck, her hands folded around the wooden box in her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing landscape. "I remember this road," she said after 20 minutes of silence. "Not exactly, but the feeling of it. My mother and I walked along a road like this. It was night. I was so tired I could barely stand, but she wouldn't let me stop. She kept saying we had to get to the safe place, the place Daddy built." Rob kept his eyes on the road but listened with the full attention of someone who understood that these words were not just memories, but pieces of a puzzle scattered across 7 decades. "Do you remember how long you stayed in the house?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. "Months. I remember seasons changing. I remember being cold at first, then warm. My mother would leave during the day sometimes, come back with food, bread, apples. Once she brought me a new doll because I'd lost mine. I don't know where she got these things. I was 4, maybe 5. Time didn't mean anything." "The letter said she marked the walls," Rob said. 127 marks. Clara's hands tightened on the box. "I remember the scratching sound. Every night before we slept. Scratch, scratch, scratch. 5 lines, then a cross through them. I thought she was drawing. I didn't understand she was counting days, counting how long we waited for him to come home." They passed through Greenwood, its courthouse square dominated by the same red brick building where Rob had searched the property records. Clara stared at it as they drove past. "I remember that building, or one like it. After my mother died, they brought me to a place with tall columns. A woman in a gray dress asked me questions I couldn't answer. What was my father's full name? Where had we lived before? I couldn't remember. I was 7 years old and I couldn't remember my own history." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a child's bewilderment at finding herself alone in a world that demanded answers she did not have. Rob knew that feeling. After the ambush in Afghanistan, after his men died and he survived, people had asked him questions he could not answer. Why had he lived? What had he done differently? He had no answers then, and the guilt of not knowing had followed him home. The turn onto the Forest Service road came sooner than Rob expected. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to dirt, and the trees closed in on both sides. Tall pines that had been saplings when Clara was a child and were now giants reaching toward the sky. Sarah's sedan struggled on the rough road, bottoming out twice on exposed roots. Rob slowed to let her keep pace, watching in his rearview mirror as she gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled determination. She had not wanted to come, had argued against it until late last night, but she was here anyway because that was what daughters did. They followed their mothers into the dark places, even when they did not understand why. The parking area at the trailhead was empty, as Rob had known it would be. He had asked Linda Torres to close this section of the forest for the day, citing structural assessment of a historical find. It was not entirely a lie. What they were about to do required privacy, space for grief and memory without the intrusion of curious hikers. Rob parked and came around to open Clara's door. She stepped down carefully, looking around with eyes that took in everything and revealed nothing. Sarah pulled up beside them, emerging from her car with the canvas bag. Inside, Rob knew, were water bottles, a first aid kit, energy bars, and probably a dozen other things Sarah thought might be necessary. Bear jumped down from the truck bed and immediately began working the perimeter, nose to the ground, tail up. Clara watched him with a faint smile. "We had a dog, when we lived in the real house before it burned, a small brown dog. I don't remember its name, but I remember it slept at the foot of my bed. What happened to it? Sarah asked. I don't know. After the fire, everything was confusion. My mother grabbed me and we ran. I don't remember seeing the dog again. Clara paused, her expression distant. I hope someone took it in. I hope it had a good life. The walk to the ravine took 15 minutes. Rob had marked the trail with small orange flags tied to branches, the kind used to mark survey points so they would not lose their way. Clara walked steadily, using a carved wooden cane that Sarah had brought, its handle worn smooth by years of use. She did not speak, saving her breath for the uneven ground, but her eyes moved constantly, taking in details. A particular tree, the angle of sunlight through the canopy, the smell of pine resin and damp earth. When they reached the edge of the ravine, Clara stopped. Her hand went to her mouth, and for a long moment she stood frozen, staring down at the exposed structure below. The rain had washed away more soil in the past week, revealing more of the stone wall, more of the collapsed roof. The door stood half open, just as Rob had left it after his first visit, a dark rectangle that seemed to pull at the eye. That's it, Clara whispered. Oh God, that's really it. Sarah moved to her mother's side, putting an arm around her shoulders. We can go back. You've seen it. That's enough. Clara shook her head slowly. No, I need to go inside. I need to remember. Rob had prepared for this. Earlier in the week, he had returned to the site with rope and climbing equipment, setting up a secure line down the slope. He had also brought lumber to reinforce the doorframe and shore up sections of the roof that looked unstable. The structure had survived 70 years, but he was not about to let it collapse on Clara Harper. He rigged Clara into a simple harness, the kind used for elderly hikers on steep trails, and belayed her down the slope with Sarah following close behind. Bear watched from above, whining softly, sensing that something important was happening, but unable to participate. The descent took 10 minutes, each step carefully placed, each handhold tested before weight was committed. At the bottom, Clara stood in the small clearing before the door and removed the harness with shaking hands. She was breathing hard, but her eyes were clear and focused. She looked at the stone walls, at the rusted hinges, at the wooden planks that had somehow held together through decades of weather and neglect. Smaller than I remembered, she said. Everything smaller, Rob understood. Memory magnified childhood spaces, turned cottages into castles and closets into caverns. The house that had seemed vast to a 4-year-old girl was in reality barely larger than a storage shed. But it had been enough. It had kept them alive. Clara approached the door slowly, reaching out to touch the wood with her fingertips. The gesture was tentative, almost reverent, as if the door might dissolve at her touch. I used to trace the grain while we waited. These patterns here, I'd make up stories about them. This one was a river. This one was a bird. She pushed the door, and it swung inward with the same groan Rob had heard on his first visit. The sound seemed to trigger something in Clara. She swayed slightly, and Sarah moved to steady her, but Clara waved her off. I'm all right. I heard that sound in my dreams for 70 years. I never knew it was real. The interior was just as Rob had left it. He had cleaned out some of the debris, swept the floor, but left everything else untouched. The fireplace with its blackened bricks, the sagging shelf, and on the far wall, still visible despite the years, the tally marks. Clara stepped inside and stopped in the center of the room, turning slowly in a complete circle. Tears ran down her face now, but she made no sound. Sarah stood in the doorway, uncertain whether to follow or give her mother space. Rob remained outside, keeping watch, giving Clara the privacy she needed for this reunion with her past. I slept there, Clara said, pointing to the corner near the fireplace. On a blanket. It was rough and scratchy and smelled like the forest. My mother slept between me and the door. Always between me and the door, so if they came, they'd have to go through her first. She crossed to the wall with the tally marks and ran her fingers along the carved lines. 127 nights we waited. And then she stopped marking them. I remember that. I remember asking her why she wasn't scratching the wall anymore, and she said there was no point. He wasn't coming back. Sarah had entered the room now, standing close to her mother, but not touching her. Mom, you don't have to. I do, Clara said. She turned to face them, and her expression held something Rob recognized from his own moments of reckoning with the past. Not quite peace, but acceptance. The understanding that some things could not be changed, but could at least be witnessed and acknowledged. I spent my whole life thinking I'd imagined this place, that it was something my child's mind made up to explain the gap in my memory. But it's real. My mother was real. What we went through was real. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out the small wooden box she had been carrying. Opening it, she removed a folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile. I kept this. It's the only thing I had from before. The Harpers let me keep it when they took me in. She unfolded the paper carefully. It was a child's drawing, done in crayon on rough paper. 3 stick figures stood in front of a square house under a yellow sun. The largest figure had brown hair and held the hand of a smaller figure with a triangle dress. Next to them stood another large figure. At the bottom, in a child's uncertain letters, were the words, "My family." I drew this the day before the mine collapsed, Clara said. May 14th, 1953. I was going to give it to my father when he came home. My mother saved it. When they found her body at the church shelter, this was in her pocket. The details struck Rob with unexpected force. Ruth Harmon, dying of pneumonia or malnutrition, or simply the accumulated weight of grief, had kept her daughter's drawing close to her heart. Even at the end, even when she had nothing else, she had held on to that small piece of hope. Clara walked to the shelf and placed the drawing on it, leaning it against the stone wall. You can stay here now, with the rest of them. She turned back to Rob and Sarah. There's something else. Something I need to tell you, something I remembered last night. They waited. Outside, a bird called, the sound sharp and clear in the stillness. My father didn't die in the mine, Clara said. Not the way they said. Rob felt his pulse quicken. What do you mean? Clara's hands were shaking now, and she pressed them together to still them. The night before he went to work that last time I woke up, I heard my parents talking. My mother was crying, begging him not to go. She said they could run, go somewhere far away, start over. And he said no. He said if he didn't go, they'd know he'd talked to the federal inspector. They'd know he was the one who reported the safety violations, and then they'd come for all of us. The words hung in the cold air of the buried room. Sarah stared at her mother. You never told me this. I didn't remember it until last night, Claire said. Or maybe I did remember, but I buried it so deep I convinced myself it was a dream. But it wasn't a dream. My father knew he was going to die. He went to that mine knowing the company had sabotaged it, knowing they were going to collapse it to silence him and anyone else who might have talked. Rob pulled out the map Martin Hayes had given him, the one with Joe's handwriting marking the structural failures. The words written at the bottom, 12 men will die unless someone acts. Joe had acted. He had reported the problems, threatened to go to federal authorities, and the Greenwood Mining Company had responded with fire and murder disguised as industrial accident. Martin Hayes told me he saw your father pulled out alive, Rob said carefully. He said the ambulance took you somewhere. That wasn't the hospital. Clara nodded slowly. I heard rumors years later. When I was in high school, there was a man who worked at the county courthouse. He told me once that there'd been a patient at the state psychiatric hospital in the 60s, a John Doe, who kept asking for Ruth and Clara. He said the man died in '68 of pneumonia. The staff thought he was delusional. She paused, her voice breaking. But he wasn't delusional. He was my father. They put him in an asylum and left him there to die alone, asking for people he thought were still alive. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Rob had suspected something like this, but hearing it spoken aloud, seeing the pain in Clara's face as she described her father's last years, made it real in a way that speculation never could. Sarah had gone pale. That's insane. Why would they do that? Why not just... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. But Rob knew what she had been about to say. Why not just kill him? The answer was simple. A dead whistleblower might inspire investigation. Questions might be asked. But a brain-damaged miner locked away in an asylum, dismissed as mentally incompetent, was just another sad casualty of a dangerous profession. No one would ask questions about him. No one would care. We need to find him, Clara said. We need to find where he's buried and bring him home. Bury him next to my mother. They should be together. Rob nodded. I'll make calls. We'll find him. Clara turned back to the room one last time, her eyes moving over every surface as if committing it to memory. Thank you for finding this place, for finding me, for making my mother's last wish come true. She left clear instructions, Rob said. She wanted you to know what happened, She wanted you to know they loved you. I know that now, Clara said. I wish I'd known it all along, but I know it now. They emerged from the buried house into afternoon light that seemed too bright after the dimness inside. Clara stood for a moment, blinking, adjusting to the change. Then she turned to look back at the structure, half hidden in the hillside, and Rob saw her expression shift from grief to something else. Determination. This place needs to be protected, she said. It's not just my family's story, it's evidence. Evidence of what the company did. Evidence that people suffered and died because of corporate greed. I agree, Rob said. I've already started the paperwork to have it declared a historical site. It'll take time, but it can be done. How long? Clara asked. Months, maybe a year. There are processes, committees, approvals. Clara shook her head. I'm 77 years old, Mr. Mitchell. I don't have a year. I need this done while I can still see it through. Sarah put a hand on her mother's arm. Mom, you're healthy. The doctor said. The doctor says what doctors say, Clara interrupted gently. But I know my body, I know my time, and I need to see this finished. Rob looked at this small woman, this survivor who had carried the weight of incomplete memories for 7 decades and had somehow remained whole despite it. He understood urgency. He had learned in Afghanistan that opportunities did not wait, that hesitation could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. I'll make it happen faster, he said. I know people. I'll make calls. Clara smiled and it transformed her face, made her look years younger. Thank you. The climb back up the slope was harder than the descent. Clara's strength was flagging, and twice she had to stop to catch her breath. But she refused to quit, refused to be carried, and eventually they reached the top where Bear waited, tail wagging with relief at their return. They sat on a fallen log near the trail, sharing water from Sarah's bottles, letting the exertion fade before attempting the walk back to the vehicles. The forest around them was alive with small sounds, squirrels chittering in the branches, a woodpecker working somewhere in the canopy, the whisper of wind through pine needles. I want to tell you something, Clara said after they had rested. She was looking at Rob, her gray eyes steady and clear. When my mother died, I was placed with the Harper family. They were good people. They loved me as much as they could love a damaged child who woke screaming from nightmares and couldn't remember where she came from. They gave me a home, an education, a life. I'm grateful for that. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But they also told me to forget, to put the past behind me and move forward. They meant well. They thought they were helping. But you can't forget something that's part of you. You can only bury it. And buried things don't stay buried. They work their way to the surface. Sarah was listening intently, hearing things her mother had never spoken aloud before. For 70 years, I felt incomplete, Clara continued. Like part of me was missing, and I'd never find it. I raised children, taught school, lived a full life, but always with this emptiness. And now you've given me back the missing piece. Not just the letters and the photograph, but the knowledge that what I remembered was real. That I'm not crazy. That my parents existed and loved me and did everything they could to protect me. Rob did not know what to say. Sarah's voice came to him across the years, her final request in the hospital. Keep living. Not just existing. Living. He had not understood what that meant until he found Ruth's letters. And in trying to complete Clara's story, he had somehow begun to complete his own. You gave me something too, he said finally. A reason to wake up. A mission that mattered. Clara reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so small and old. Then we saved each other. They sat there in the dappled sunlight, 3 people in a dorm, bound together by a story that had waited 70 years to be told. Around them, the forest continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human grief and human healing, but witness to both. After a while, they walked back to the vehicles. The return journey was quieter, each person lost in their own thoughts. Clara dozed in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, the wooden box secure in her lap. Sarah followed in her sedan, and Rob could see her in the rearview mirror, wiping her eyes periodically, processing what she had learned about her family's hidden history. When they reached Clara's house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Rob helped Clara from the truck, carrying the ammunition box for her. At her door, she turned to him one more time. Will you come to dinner tomorrow night? She asked. You and anyone else who's been part of this. That Martin Hayes, if he's able. I want to thank everyone properly. Rob hesitated. He was not comfortable with social gatherings, with being thanked or celebrated, but he saw in Clara's face that this was important to her, a way of closing one chapter and beginning another. "I'll be there," he said. She smiled and disappeared into her house. Sarah lingered on the porch, waiting until her mother was safely inside before approaching Rob. "I need to apologize," she said. "I thought you were some kind of con artist, someone trying to take advantage of an old woman." "It's all right," Rob said. "You were protecting your mother. I respect that." "She's different now," Sarah said. "Since you found her. Lighter somehow, like she's been carrying a weight and finally got to set it down. I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't need to," Rob said. "Just take care of her. Make sure she gets to see this through." Sarah nodded. "I will. And Mr. Mitchell, thank you for keeping my grandmother's promise." She went inside and Rob stood alone in the gathering darkness. Bear jumped down from the truck and pressed against his leg. Rob reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Come on, boy, let's go home." But as he drove back toward his cabin, he realized that home meant something different now than it had a week ago. It was not just a place to sleep and wait for the next day. It was a place he returned to from purpose, from meaningful work, from connections that mattered. The forest road was dark, his headlights cutting tunnels through the blackness. Somewhere behind him, in Meridian, Clara Harper was likely sitting in her chair by the window, holding the photograph of her parents, finally understanding the full shape of her own story. And somewhere else, in files and records scattered across Mississippi, were the pieces of evidence that would prove Joseph Harmon had been murdered not by accident, but by design. That 12 men had died because a company valued profit over safety. That a woman and her child had been hunted and hidden and left to survive on their own. Rob knew what he had to do next. He had to find Joseph Harmon's final resting place. He had to gather the evidence. He had to make sure the story did not end with discovery, but with justice, however delayed. The cabin appeared in his headlights, small and dark and familiar. He parked, let Bear out, and stood for a moment looking at the stars visible through gaps in the cloud cover. Somewhere up there, he liked to think, Sarah was watching. Not his Sarah, but Ruth and Joe, looking down at the mess they had left behind and seeing finally that someone had cared enough to clean it up. He went inside, made coffee, and sat at his table with his laptop open and a notepad beside it. There was work to do, calls to make, records to search, a promise to keep. And for the first time in 4 years, Robert Mitchell felt fully, completely alive. The search for Joseph Harmon's final resting place began in the basement archives of the Mississippi State Hospital, a sprawling complex of red brick buildings 40 miles north of Jackson. Rob had spent 3 days making phone calls, navigating layers of bureaucracy, invoking privacy laws and historical research exemptions, before finally securing permission to access patient records from the 1950s and 60s. The woman who met him at the archive entrance was younger than he expected, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back severe and glasses that magnified her eyes. "You're looking for a John Doe admitted in 1953?" she asked, leading him down a stairwell that smelled of mildew and old paper. "Yes, white male, approximately 34 years old, severe trauma from a mining accident, would have been transferred from Greenwood area." The archivist unlocked a heavy metal door and gestured him into a long, narrow room lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered and hummed. "We have 47 John Does admitted between 1950 and 1960. Most of them were never identified. They died here and were buried in the hospital cemetery with numbers instead of names." She pulled open a drawer and began flipping through folders, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "The records from that era are incomplete. Budget cuts, staff shortages, a fire in '64 that destroyed a lot of documentation. What exactly are you hoping to find?" "Proof," Rob said. "Proof that a man named Joseph Harmon didn't die in a mine collapse. That he was committed here against his will and left to die." The archivist looked up at him, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to something more engaged. "That's a serious accusation. I have evidence." Rob pulled out the folder he had been carrying, the one containing photocopies of Ruth's letters, the map Martin Hayes had given him, newspaper clippings about the mine disaster. A company covered up safety violations. When one of their workers threatened to report them, they burned his house and staged an accident. He survived, but they had him declared mentally incompetent and committed. The archivist took the folder and began reading, As she worked through the documents, her expression darkened. When she finished, she closed the folder carefully and handed it back. "Wait here." She disappeared into the stacks, and Rob stood alone in the humming silence of the archive. Through a small window set high in the wall, he could see a slice of sky, gray and overcast. Clara's voice came to him from yesterday's dinner, her words to the gathered friends and family. "To the people who remember, and to the man who kept my mother's promise." The archivist returned carrying a thin folder, its edges soft with age. Patient 4729, admitted May 16, 1953, transferred from Greenwood County, diagnosed with traumatic brain injury and acute psychosis. She opened the folder and read aloud. Patient presents with severe confusion, memory loss, and delusional behavior. Claims to be Joseph Harmon, but cannot provide verifiable details. Responds violently to restraints. Recommended for long-term commitment. Rob's hands clenched. What else? The archivist flipped through pages covered in cramped handwriting. Monthly evaluations for 15 years. Most of them note continued confusion and requests to see people named Ruth and Clara. In 1965, there's a note from a new psychiatrist. She read, "Patient experienced apparent breakthrough during therapy session. Became lucid and coherent for approximately 20 minutes. Asked what year it was. When informed it was 1965, patient became extremely agitated and had to be sedated. Patient kept repeating, 'I have to find them, I promised. Recommend continued observation.'" The words hit Rob like a physical blow. In 1965, 12 years after the mine collapse, Joseph Harmon had remembered, had known who he was, known he had a wife and daughter waiting, and they had drugged him back into silence. "When did he die?" Rob asked, his voice rough. "January 14th, 1968. Cause of death listed as pneumonia." The archivist paused. "He was buried in Plot 217, Hospital Cemetery. No marker, just a metal stake with the patient number." Rob wrote down the location. "Can I see the cemetery?" "It's behind the old tuberculosis ward. I can take you there." They walked through the hospital grounds, past buildings that had been abandoned for decades, their windows broken and walls covered in graffiti. The cemetery lay at the far edge of the property, surrounded by a chain-link fence that sagged in places. Inside were hundreds of small metal markers, arranged in neat rows like soldiers at attention. Most had numbers, a few had names. The archivist led him to the section for patients who had died in the 1960s. She counted rows, then plots, and stopped at a marker so rusted it was barely readable. "Here, 4729. Rob knelt beside the marker, his knees pressing into grass that badly needed mowing. This was where Joseph Harmon had ended up. Not in a mine shaft with the men he had tried to save, not beside his wife who had waited for him until her death, but in an unmarked grave in a potter's field, remembered only as a number in a filing system. He pulled out his phone and took photographs. The marker, the location, the surrounding graves. Evidence. Then he stood and looked at the archivist. "I need to exhume this body. I need to prove who he is and give him a proper burial." "That's going to require court orders," she said. "Next of kin permission. DNA testing." "I have next of kin. His daughter is still alive." The archivist pulled out her own phone and began typing notes. "I'll help you with the paperwork. What they did to this man, if your evidence is accurate, is unconscionable. He deserves better than this." The legal process took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of forms and petitions, of phone calls with county clerks and state officials, of Clara signing documents in her careful schoolteacher handwriting. Rob worked with a lawyer Rebecca Hayes had recommended, a woman in her 60s who specialized in historical injustices and had a reputation for making bureaucracies bend. During those 3 weeks, Rebecca published her first article about the case. It ran on the front page of the Greenwood Tribune under the headline, "Buried Truth: How a Mississippi Mining Company Silenced a Whistleblower." The story laid out everything: the safety violations, the fire, the staged collapse, Joseph Harmon's survival and subsequent disappearance, Ruth and Clara's years in hiding. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Other newspapers picked up the story. Television news crews arrived in Greenwood, interviewing Martin Hayes and the few surviving miners who remembered the disaster. Families of the 12 men who had died in the collapse came forward with their own stories of company, intimidation, and suppressed evidence. And then, on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Rob's visit to the state hospital, a courier arrived at his cabin with a package. Inside was a manila envelope marked Brennan and Associates, attorneys at law. Rob opened it carefully, half expecting legal threats, and found instead a letter. "Dear Mr. Mitchell," it began, "my name is Thomas Brennan. My grandfather was Harold Brennan, Chief Operations Officer of Greenwood Mining Company from 1948 to 1954. I am writing to you because I recently discovered documents in my late father's papers that relate to your investigation into Joseph Harmon's death." Rob's pulse quickened. He read faster. "My grandfather kept detailed records of company operations, including actions taken against workers who were deemed security risks. Among these records are memoranda discussing Joseph Harmon specifically. The documents make clear that the mine collapse of May 1953 was not accidental, but deliberately triggered to eliminate Harmon and destroy evidence of safety violations. Further, the documents show that my grandfather arranged for Harmon's commitment to the state hospital and paid monthly fees to ensure he remained there. I am 70 years old and dying of lung cancer. I have perhaps 6 months to live. I cannot undo what my grandfather did, but I can provide you with proof. Enclosed are copies of the relevant documents. The originals are being held in a safe deposit box and will be released to authorities upon my death. I am also establishing a trust fund to provide compensation to the families of all victims of the 1953 disaster. I know this does not absolve my family of responsibility. I know it does not bring back the dead or restore the years stolen from Mrs. Harper. But it is what I can do. Please give Mrs. Harper my sincere apologies. The sins of the grandfather should not define the grandson, but they cannot be ignored either. Respectfully, Thomas Brennan." Rob sat at his table for a long time, reading and rereading the letter. Then he opened the attached documents. They were photocopies, but clear enough to read. Memos from Harold Brennan to the mine foreman. Instructions to ignore safety reports. A handwritten note that said, "Harmon problem must be resolved permanently." Financial records showing payments to a Dr. Wendell Cross for consultation services that dated from May 1953 through January 1968, ending precisely when Joseph Harmon died. It was everything they needed, complete, undeniable proof of conspiracy and murder. Rob called Clara first. She listened in silence as he explained what had arrived, what it meant. When he finished, she was quiet for so long he thought the connection had dropped. "Clara, you still there?" "I'm here. I was just thinking about my father, about how he knew what they would do to him and went anyway. He could have run, he could have taken us and disappeared. But he went to work that day because he thought he could save those other men. And they killed him for it." "Not just killed," Rob said. "They erased him, turned him into a number, made sure he died alone and forgotten." "But he's not forgotten now," Clara said, and her voice had steel in it. "Now the whole world knows what happened. Now there will be justice." The exhumation took place on a cold morning in early November. The court had granted permission based on the new evidence, and a forensic team from the state medical examiner's office conducted the work with careful precision. Rob and Clara were not allowed at the gravesite during the actual exhumation, but they waited in a trailer nearby while the team worked. Clara had aged visibly in the past month. The energy that had sustained her through the return to the buried house and the dinners with family had faded, leaving her looking fragile and tired. Sarah sat beside her, holding her hand, while Clara's other children waited outside with their families. "Are you sure you want to be here for this?" Sarah asked her mother for perhaps the 10th time. "I'm sure. I wasn't there when he died. I should be here when he comes home." The forensic anthropologist emerged from the gravesite after 3 hours. She was a tall woman in her 40s, wearing mud-stained coveralls and carrying a clipboard. She approached Clara with the careful gentleness of someone who understood the weight of what she was about to say. "Mrs. Harper, we've successfully recovered the remains. Based on preliminary examination, the individual was a white male, approximately 30 to 40 years old at time of death. We found evidence of healed fractures consistent with the injuries described in the mine accident report. There was also evidence of long-term malnutrition and neglect." Clara's face was pale but composed. "Can you tell if it's him? My father? We'll need DNA confirmation, which will take a few weeks. But if you can provide a DNA sample, we can establish parentage with certainty." Clara nodded. "I'll give you whatever you need." The anthropologist hesitated, then said, "There's something else you should know. We found a small object buried with the remains. It appears to be a wedding ring with an inscription. She pulled a small evidence bag from her pocket. Inside was a tarnished gold band. Through the plastic, Rob could just make out engraved letters. JH and RH 1945. Clara took the bag with shaking hands and pressed it against her heart. That's him. That's my father. The DNA results came back 2 weeks later, confirming what Clara had already known in her heart. Patient 4729 was Joseph Elijah Harmon, born 1919, died 1968, survived by a daughter, Clara Harmon Harper. The state of Mississippi issued a formal death certificate to replace the one from 1953, and the Greenwood County prosecutor opened an investigation into the actions of Greenwood Mining Company and its officers. Thomas Brennan died before he could be questioned, but his documents became the foundation of a case that would eventually lead to the posthumous revocation of his grandfather's business licenses and a formal apology from the state. The trust fund he had established distributed $2 million among the families of the disaster victims, including a substantial sum to Clara. She donated most of it to create the Joseph Harmon Whistleblower Protection Fund, which provided legal and financial support to workers who reported safety violations. The rest she used to purchase the land surrounding the buried house, ensuring it could never be developed or destroyed. The funeral was held on a Saturday in December, when the Mississippi winter had turned the world gray and cold, but not yet cruel. St. Luke's Parish was too small for the crowd that showed up, so they held the service outdoors in the church cemetery, where a new gravestone waited beside Ruth Harmon's marker. Rob stood near the back of the gathering, uncomfortable in the suit he had bought specifically for this occasion. Bear sat beside him wearing a service dog vest that granted him access to the ceremony. The crowd numbered over 300 people, families of the other miners, reporters, local politicians who had suddenly discovered the importance of workers' rights, students from the high school where Clara had taught for 30 years. Father Cooper conducted the service with simple dignity, reading from scripture and offering prayers for the dead and comfort for the living. Martin Hayes spoke, his voice breaking as he described his friendship with Joe Harmon and the guilt he had carried for 7 decades. Several of Clara's former students spoke about her dedication to teaching and her insistence that truth mattered, even when it was painful. Then Clara herself rose to speak. She stood at the podium, small and straight-backed, and looked out at the assembled crowd. For a moment she said nothing, just let her eyes move over the faces of people who had come to honor her father. My father was 34 years old when they killed him, she began, her voice clear and strong despite her age. He had a wife who loved him and a daughter who adored him. He had friends who trusted him and a conscience that would not let him stay silent when he saw wrong being done. They tried to erase him. They tried to make it so he never existed, so his death meant nothing. But they failed. She paused, looking down at the coffin that held her father's remains. He existed. He mattered. And because of the courage of people like Robert Mitchell, who found my mother's letters and refused to let our story stay buried, the world knows what happened. The world knows that ordinary people can stand up to powerful institutions. That truth, no matter how long it takes, will eventually come to light. Her voice wavered slightly. I wish I had known him as an adult. I wish I could have thanked him for what he tried to do. But I know him now in a way I never could have as a child. I know his courage, I know his integrity, and I know that he died believing his sacrifice meant something. She looked up at the crowd again. Make it mean something. When you see wrong being done, speak up. When you see people being hurt by greed or negligence, act. Don't let my father's death be for nothing. The crowd was silent. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes and were just listening. Clara stepped down from the podium and walked to the coffin. She placed her hand on it, and Rob could see her lips moving in words only she and her father would ever hear. The burial was simple. The coffin was lowered into the ground beside Ruth's grave, and the new headstone was revealed. It was larger than the others in the cemetery, made of polished granite that caught the weak winter light. Joseph Elijah Harmon, 1919 to 1968, beloved husband, father, and friend. He stood for truth when others stayed silent. He gave his life so others might live. Greater love hath no man than this. Beside it, Ruth's smaller stone had been replaced with a matching one. Ruth Marie Harmon, 1922 to 1954. Faithful wife and devoted mother. She kept the truth alive so it could set us free. People filed past, leaving flowers and small stones according to the Jewish custom that Father Cooper had explained was a sign of remembrance. Rob waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching. He stood between the two graves and allowed himself to remember the journey that had brought him here. The storm, the landslide, the letters, and the promise he had made to a woman who had been dead for 70 years. Clara appeared beside him, seeming to materialize from the dispersing crowd. "Thank you. I didn't do anything special," Rob said. "I just found some letters." "You did more than that. You cared. You could have turned those letters over to some museum and walked away. But you made it personal. You made my parents matter to you." Rob thought about that, about how finding Ruth's letters had given him purpose when he had none, how Clara's story had pulled him out of the numbness that had defined his life since Sarah's death. "They gave me something too." Clara smiled. "Then we're even." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last of the mourners depart. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In the distance, Rob could hear the sound of the highway, the endless flow of traffic going somewhere, anywhere, everywhere. "What happens now?" Clara asked. "Now," Rob considered, "now we make sure people remember. The historical site designation came through last week. The buried house is officially protected. I'm working with the Park Service to create interpretive signs, maybe a small museum. Your father's story will be told." "Good," Clara said. She looked tired but satisfied, like someone who had run a long race and could finally rest. "That's good." 2 weeks later, on a cold January morning, Clara Harper died peacefully in her sleep. Sarah found her in her chair by the window, the photograph of her parents held loosely in her hands, a slight smile on her face. The doctor said it was heart failure, but Rob thought it was something simpler than that. She had finished her work. She had brought her parents home. She had made their story matter. And having done that, she was ready to join them. The funeral was smaller than Joseph's had been, more intimate. Just family and close friends. Rob sat in the back pew of St. Luke's and listened as Clara's children and grandchildren spoke about her life. The years of teaching, the quiet kindness, the way she never gave up on a student, never stopped believing that everyone deserved to know their own truth. At the burial, they lowered her coffin into a plot on the other side of her parents, so that in death she was flanked by the mother and father she had barely known in life. The headstone was already in place, matching the style of the other two. Clara May Harmon Harper, 1948 to 2025. Daughter, mother, teacher, keeper of memories. She waited 70 years for the truth and lived to see it honored. Rob placed a stone on her grave, then one on Ruth's, then one on Joseph's. 3 people who had suffered and endured and finally found peace. 3 lives that mattered. As he walked back to his truck, Sarah caught up with him. "Mom left you something," she said, handing him a small envelope. "She gave it to me a month ago, told me to give it to you after she was gone." Rob opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in Clara's careful handwriting. "Dear Rob," it began, "if you're reading this, I've joined my parents at last. I'm not sad about that. I've lived a long life, longer than either of them got to, and I've done what I needed to do. But before I go, I want to make sure you understand something important. You saved me, not just by finding those letters, but by caring enough to see the search through. You gave me back my history, my identity, the missing pieces of myself. You made me whole again. And in doing that, you became whole again too. I saw it happen. I watched you transform from a man going through the motions to a man with purpose. The buried house is yours now. Legally, I've signed over the deed. But more than that, spiritually, it's yours. You're its keeper, just as my father was, just as my mother was. Tell the story. Make sure people remember. That's the legacy we leave behind, all of us. Not money or property, but the stories that outlive us. One more thing. In the house, behind the 3rd brick from the left in the fireplace, there's a loose stone. Behind it is a small wooden box. My mother left it there, and I never opened it. I think it's meant for you. Whatever's inside, it's yours. Thank you, Robert Mitchell. Thank you for being the kind of man who keeps promises, even promises made by strangers. Thank you for showing me that my parents' love was real and strong and worth remembering. Your friend Clara. Rob stood in the cemetery parking lot, reading and rereading the letter until the words blurred. When he looked up, Sarah was watching him with red-rimmed eyes. "She thought of you as family," Sarah said. "The son she never had," she used to say. "The one who understood." Rob folded the letter carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, close to his heart. She was family to me, too. That evening, as the sun set over the Mississippi forest, Rob returned to the buried house. He had not been there since the day he brought Clara back, had not wanted to disturb the space that had become in his mind almost sacred. But now he had permission, a mission, a final request to fulfill. The descent into the ravine was easier now. He had installed a proper ladder and reinforced the path. Inside the house, he had set up LED lights that ran on batteries, and the space no longer felt like a tomb but like a memorial, a place where the past was honored rather than hidden. He went to the fireplace and counted bricks. Third from the left, he pressed on it and felt it shift slightly. Working carefully, he removed the brick and reached into the gap behind it. His fingers touched wood and he pulled out a small box, no bigger than a deck of cards. It was similar to the one that had held the locket, but older. The wood darkened almost to black. He sat on the floor, his back against the stone wall, and opened it. Inside were 3 items: a small folded piece of paper, a silver dollar dated 1945, and a tarnished military dog tag. Rob picked up the dog tag first. It read, Joseph E. Harmon, U.S. Army, blood type O positive. His service tag from World War II. Ruth had kept it, hidden it, preserved it as proof that her husband had existed and served and mattered. Next, the silver dollar. On the back, in tiny engraved letters, were the words, Our Wedding Day, J and R, June 2nd, 1945. A token from the year they married, kept safe through everything that followed. Finally, the paper. Rob unfolded it with shaking hands. It was a note written in Ruth's handwriting, but different from the letters. This was written with a steady hand, with time and care. To the keeper who finds us, it read, You've given my daughter back her history. You've proven that we existed, that we loved, that we tried. For that, I thank you. Wear my husband's tags. Remember him. And know that you are not alone in your watch. Those who keep faith with the dead are never truly alone. The past stands with them. Ruth Harmon, March 1954. Rob sat in the buried house, holding Ruth's final message, and felt something break open inside him. Not grief exactly, but a kind of release, as if he had been holding his breath for 4 years and could finally exhale. He put the dog tags around his neck, letting them hang beside his own Marine Corps tags. 2 soldiers, 2 wars, 2 men who had tried to do right and paid the price. Outside, night was falling, and through the open door he could see stars beginning to appear. Bear sat at the entrance, patient and watchful. From somewhere in the forest came the call of an owl, low and mournful. Rob stood and walked to the wall where the tally marks were carved. 127 days Ruth had counted. 127 nights she had waited for a man who would never come home. And yet she had kept faith, had kept the truth alive, had trusted that someday someone would find her message and act on it. He placed his hand on the marks, feeling the grooves carved by Ruth's desperate counting. I kept your promise, he said softly to the empty room. Your daughter knew. She understood. And now she's with you. The words echoed slightly in the small space, then faded into silence. Rob turned off the lights, locked the door, and climbed back up to the forest floor. Bear fell into step beside him, and together they walked the dark trail back to the truck. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human sorrow and human courage, but witness to both. And somewhere in that vast darkness, Rob liked to think, 3 souls had finally found their way home. Spring came to the Mississippi forest with a violence that surprised even the locals who had lived there all their lives. One day the trees were bare and skeletal, and the next, dogwoods exploded into white blooms, and the air turned thick with the smell of new growth and possibility. Rob stood at the edge of the ravine where he had first discovered the buried house 6 months ago, watching a work crew carefully install the last section of wooden railing along the improved trail. The transformation had been remarkable. What was once an unmarked slope accessible only to those willing to risk a dangerous descent was now a proper pathway with switchbacks and safety features, designed to allow anyone to visit the site regardless of age or physical ability. The historical site designation had brought funding from the National Park Service and the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. With that funding came responsibility, oversight, and the kind of bureaucratic attention Rob had spent most of his adult life avoiding. But he had learned to navigate it, had discovered that sometimes the price of preserving something important was filling out forms and sitting through committee meetings where people talked more than they listened. He was 53 now, his hair more gray than brown, the lines around his eyes deeper. But he stood straighter than he had a year ago, moved with purpose instead of habit. The other Rangers had noticed the change. Linda Torres had mentioned it during his performance review, noting that he had transformed from a competent but disengaged employee into someone who took initiative, who cared about outcomes, who seemed to have rediscovered why the work mattered. The lead contractor, a man named James Wilson who had served in the Army during Desert Storm, approached with a clipboard and a satisfied expression. "That's the last of it. We're on schedule and under budget. The dedication ceremony is still set for May 15th? Yes, 72 years to the day after the mine collapse." Wilson nodded, understanding the significance. "My grandfather was a coal miner in West Virginia. Died of black lung when I was 10. Men like Joseph Harmon, they were fighting the same fight everywhere, trying to make the work safer, trying to protect their brothers. Most of them got crushed for it. Not this time," Rob said. "This time the story gets told right." After Wilson and his crew departed, Rob descended the new trail to the buried house. The structure itself had been stabilized and weatherproofed, its stone walls reinforced and the collapsed portions of the roof carefully reconstructed using period-appropriate materials. But the interior had been left largely as he had found it. The tally marks remained on the wall, now protected behind a sheet of museum-quality glass. The fireplace stood as it had for 70 years, its bricks blackened with old soot. Even the shelf where Clara had placed her childhood drawing still held that fragile piece of paper, now preserved in an archival frame. What had changed was the context. Interpretive panels lined the walls, telling the story in Clara's own words, excerpted from interviews she had given to Rebecca Hayes before her death. Photographs showed the Harmon family in better days, images that Sarah had provided from Clara's personal collection. The letters Ruth had written were displayed in climate-controlled cases, their faded ink and desperate words visible to anyone who took the time to read them. Rob had insisted on one addition that the historical committee had initially resisted. In the corner where Clara remembered sleeping as a child, he had placed a simple wooden bench, not for sitting, but as a memorial. Attached to it was a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of all families torn apart by corporate greed and all children who grew up not knowing their own stories. May we do better." He walked through the space slowly, checking details, making sure everything was ready for tomorrow's dedication. His phone buzzed, a text from Rebecca Hayes. "Big crowd already gathering at the cemetery. You should head over. Today is going to be something special." Rob climbed back up to ground level and walked to his truck. Bear, now 5 years old and starting to show gray around his muzzle, waited patiently in the shade. The dog had become something of a celebrity in the months since the story broke, his image appearing in several of the newspaper articles about the discovery. The drive to Greenwood Cemetery took 20 minutes. As Rebecca had warned, the parking lot was already full, and cars lined both sides of the road leading to the entrance. Rob parked half a mile away and walked, Bear at his heel, past news vans from Jackson and Memphis, past clusters of people in Sunday clothes despite it being a Thursday, past a group of high school students wearing matching T-shirts that read, "Truth Matters, Joseph Harmon Memorial Service." The cemetery had been transformed. A stage had been erected near the Harmon family graves, with a sound system and rows of white folding chairs. Television cameras were positioned at strategic angles. A tent had been set up to provide shade, though the morning was still cool enough that most people seemed comfortable in the open air. Sarah Harper saw him and waved him over to the front row, where seats had been reserved for family and special guests. Martin Hayes was already there, looking frail but alert in a dark suit that hung loose on his diminished frame. Father Cooper sat beside him, and next to the priest was a woman Rob did not immediately recognize until she stood and extended her hand. "Mr. Mitchell? I'm Elizabeth Harmon, Joseph's niece. My father was his younger brother." Rob shook her hand, startled. "I didn't know Joseph had siblings." "He had two. My father died in '98, but he never stopped talking about Uncle Joe. Never believed the story about the mine collapse. He spent years trying to find out what really happened, but the company stonewalled him at every turn." She gestured to the three younger people sitting beside her. "These are my children, Joseph's great nieces and nephew. We came from Oregon when we heard about the ceremony." Rob looked at this unexpected branch of the family tree and felt a profound sense of completion. The Harmons had not ended with Clara. The bloodline continued, spread across the country, carrying forward whatever genetic and spiritual inheritance Joseph and Ruth had left behind. The ceremony began at exactly 10 o'clock. The governor of Mississippi took the podium first, speaking about justice delayed but not denied, about the importance of confronting difficult history. It was a political speech, carefully crafted, and Rob tuned most of it out. But then the governor said something that caught his attention. Today I am announcing the creation of the Joseph Harmon Worker Protection Act, which will strengthen whistleblower protections for employees in high-risk industries and establish mandatory safety audits for mining and manufacturing operations. This legislation will be introduced in the next session. The crowd applauded and Rob saw Sarah wipe her eyes. Legislation, real policy change born from one man's courage and one woman's refusal to let the truth die. Rebecca Hayes spoke next, describing the journalistic investigation that had helped bring the full story to light. She announced that her book about the case, titled The Buried House, A Mississippi Family's Fight for Justice, would be published in the fall by a major New York publisher. Film producers had already optioned the rights, she added, and though details were still being worked out, the story would reach millions. Then it was Martin's turn. The old man approached the podium slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. When he gripped the edges and looked out at the crowd, his voice was clear and strong. I'm 96 years old. I've lived longer than I probably deserve to, considering I spent most of my life as a coward. He paused. When Joe Harmon stood up to the company, I stayed silent. When they burned his house, I looked away. When they killed him and covered it up, I kept my mouth shut because I was afraid for my jaw, my family, my comfortable life. The crowd was absolutely still. For 72 years, I carried that guilt. But when Robert Mitchell found Ruth's letters and came looking for answers, I saw a chance to finally do what I should have done 72 years ago. Tell the truth. He looked directly at the Harmon family graves. Joe, I'm sorry it took so long, but your story is known now. Your sacrifice mattered. Martin stepped down to sustained applause, and Sarah rose to help him back to his seat. Rob reached over to grip the old man's shoulder. You did good. Joe would be proud. Sarah spoke next, reading from her mother's journals. The words were Clara's, but Sarah's voice gave them weight and presence. She read about the day Rob appeared on her doorstep with the ammunition box, about the overwhelming relief of finally knowing the truth. Finally, it was Rob's turn. He had not wanted to speak, had argued against it, but Sarah had insisted. He approached the podium with reluctance, acutely aware of the cameras and the crowd. I'm a park ranger, he began. My job is to protect forests and trails and wildlife. When I found the buried house, my first thought was that I had stumbled onto an archaeological site. I didn't expect it to change my life. He paused, gathering his thoughts. 4 years ago, my wife died of cancer. After she was gone, I stopped living. I was breathing, going through the motions, but I wasn't really alive. Then I found Ruth Harmon's letters. And in those letters was a mission, a dying woman asking someone to find her daughter and tell her what happened. That mission gave me a reason to wake up. The crowd was silent, attentive. These 3 people saved me, Rob continued, looking at the headstones. They didn't know me, they died before I was born, but their story pulled me back from the edge. And I'm not the only one. I've received letters from people all over the country who read about the Harmons and found courage to speak up about injustices in their own lives. He pulled out the dog tags he wore around his neck, Joseph's tags, and his own hanging side by side. Ruth Harmon left a note for whoever found her letters. She said that those who keep faith with the dead are never alone. The past stands with us. The people who came before, who fought and refused to give up, they're still here in spirit, still pushing us to do better. He tucked the tags back under his shirt. This historical site we're dedicating today is about preserving the truth, about making sure that when powerful people try to silence the vulnerable, there are keepers who refuse to let the past stay buried. That's what we all have to be. Keepers of truth, of justice, of each other. The applause started slowly and built to something powerful. Rob stepped away from the podium and returned to his seat, his heart pounding. The final part of the ceremony was the unveiling of a new memorial, a bronze statue, life-size, depicting a man in worker's clothes, a woman holding a small child, all 3 looking toward the horizon. At the base was a plaque with their names in a single line. They kept the truth alive so we might be free. As the crowd dispersed to walk the trail and tour the historical site, Rob remained at the graves. Martin Hayes approached, moving slowly but steadily. "I won't make it to next year's ceremony," Martin said without preamble. "Don't say that," Rob started, but Martin raised a hand. "I'm 96 and tired, son. I've made my peace." He pulled a worn envelope from his jacket pocket. "This is for you. Don't open it until I'm gone." Rob took the envelope, feeling its weight. Martin shook his hand, holding it firmly for a long moment, then turned and walked away. The crowds at the historical site exceeded all expectations. Over 1,000 people visited in the first week alone. Rob found himself giving impromptu tours several times a week, telling the story to people who arrived with questions and left with a deeper understanding. One afternoon in June, a man about Rob's age appeared at the site wearing a faded United Auto Workers jacket. He introduced himself as David Chen, a factory worker from Detroit. "My father was a safety inspector in the 80s, Chen said. He reported violations at an auto plant and got blacklisted. Lost our house. My mother left him. He died bitter and broken." Chen's eyes were wet. But reading about Joseph Harmon, seeing that sometimes the truth does come out, it helps. Rob shook the man's hand and gave him one of the memorial brochures. "Your father mattered. What he did mattered." In July, Martin Hayes died peacefully in his sleep. His funeral was well attended, and at his request, he was buried in Greenwood Cemetery, not far from the Harmon family graves. Rob spoke at the service, describing Martin's courage in finally telling the truth. After the funeral, Rob opened the envelope Martin had given him. Inside were 3 items: a photograph of Joseph and Martin standing together at the quarry, young and strong and smiling. A letter Martin had written but never sent, addressed to Joseph, asking for forgiveness. And a small metal pin, a Union badge from the United Mine Workers of America, 1952. Rob added the photograph to the display at the buried house and had Martin's letter framed beside it. The Union pin he kept, adding it to the dog tags he wore. August brought an unexpected change. Rob was conducting a tour for a workplace safety advocacy group when he noticed one woman lingering after the others had left. She was about his age, maybe 48 or 49, with dark hair streaked with gray and eyes that looked like they had seen their share of sorrow. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Ellen Reeves. My husband was killed in a construction accident 5 years ago. I wanted to thank you for telling this story. It helps to know we're not alone." They talked for 2 hours about loss and guilt and the hard work of building a new life after the old one ended. When the sun began to set, Rob found himself asking, "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" Ellen smiled. "I'd like that." They began seeing each other regularly. Ellen understood him in ways most people could not, understood what it meant to carry the weight of the dead, to honor them not through grief but through action. She brought lightness to his life without diminishing the weight of his responsibilities. She understood when he needed to spend a day at the buried house, and he understood when she needed to talk about her husband. By October, the historical site had welcomed over 10,000 visitors. The Park Service reported that it had become one of the most visited civil rights and labor history sites in Mississippi. The state legislature, true to the governor's promise, passed the Joseph Harmon Worker Protection Act with bipartisan support. Rob attended the signing ceremony in Jackson, standing beside Sarah and the Harmon extended family as the governor put pen to paper. In November came the news that Rebecca's book had been acquired for a substantial advance, with plans for a national book tour. The film adaptation was moving forward with a respected director attached. Sarah was cautious about Hollywood involvement, but recognized the potential to reach even more people. December brought the first cold snap, and with it, a quiet satisfaction. Rob stood at the overlook near the buried house, watching his breath cloud in the air. Bear, graying but still strong, sat beside him. A year ago, he had been a man with no future, living in the shadow of his past. Now he was a keeper of stories, a guardian of truth, a man with purpose and connection and hope. And he had Ellen, whose presence in his life felt like the first thaw after a long winter. The nightmares from Afghanistan had faded too, he realized. Not disappeared entirely, but grown quieter, less insistent. The faces of the men he had lost no longer haunted every sleeping hour. He had learned something Clara had tried to teach him, that honoring the dead meant living fully, not drowning in guilt. The first anniversary ceremony, held on May 15, 2026, was even larger than the dedication. Over 2,000 people attended. Rob gave another speech, shorter this time, focused on the continuing importance of remembering. He introduced the first recipient of the annual Joseph Harmon Courage Award, a young woman who had reported safety violations at a chemical plant and lost her job as a result. Standing at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, Rob understood something Clara had tried to tell him before she died. Stories do not end. They ripple outward, touching lives, changing minds, inspiring action. After the ceremony, Rob walked to the buried house. The site was closed to visitors for the evening, giving him privacy. He sat on the memorial bench, not to reflect this time, but to rest. Ellen was meeting him for dinner, and afterward they planned to watch the stars from his porch. As the sun set and the forest filled with evening sounds, a young couple appeared at the entrance to the house. They looked uncertain, as if worried they were trespassing. "Is it okay if we come in?" the man asked. "I know the site is closed, but we drove 8 hours to get here." Rob stood. "It's all right, come in." They entered slowly, taking in the tally marks, the letters, the photographs. The woman read Ruth's final letter and began to cry. "My grandmother was a whistleblower. She reported abuse at a nursing home and lost everything. I always wondered if it was worth it." "It was worth it," Rob said with certainty. "It's always worth it." The couple stayed for an hour asking questions, sharing their own story. When they finally left, thanking him repeatedly, Rob locked the house and walked back to his truck. Ellen was waiting at his cabin when he arrived, sitting on the porch with 2 glasses of wine. Bear greeted her enthusiastically, and she scratched behind his ears while Rob climbed the steps. "How was your day?" she asked. "Good," Rob said, settling into the chair beside her. A young couple came by. Their grandmother was a whistleblower. They needed to know her sacrifice mattered. Ellen handed him a glass of wine. "And you told them it did?" "Yes." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. After a while, Ellen said, "I've been thinking about something. My lease is up next month. I was wondering if you'd want company out here permanently." Rob looked at her, this woman who had appeared in his life at exactly the right moment, who understood his silences and his missions, who made him laugh and think and hope. "I'd like that," he said. She smiled and leaned against his shoulder. Bear settled at their feet with a contented sigh. Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Rob thought about the journey that had brought him here. From grief and isolation to purpose and connection. From a man who had given up to a man who kept promises. The buried house stood in the forest, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten. And Rob Mitchell, keeper of its stories, guardian of its truth, had finally found his way home. Somewhere in that vast darkness overhead, he liked to think, 3 souls watched and approved. Their story had been told. Their sacrifice had been honored. Their love had been proven stronger than all the forces that had tried to bury it. The forest breathed around him, ancient and patient. Bear's steady breathing marked time. Ellen's warmth beside him promised tomorrow. And for the first time in years, tomorrow felt like something worth building. Rob raised his glass to the stars. "To the keepers," he said softly. Ellen touched her glass to his. "To the keepers." They drank, and the night settled around them like a benediction. In the distance, an owl called. The wind moved through the pines, and in a small house buried in a hillside, the past kept its patient watch, waiting for the next person who would need to know that courage matters, that truth matters, that love endures. The story was not over. It would never be over, because stories like this do not end. They ripple forward through time, touching lives not yet lived, inspiring courage not yet born, proving again and again that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to remember, to speak, to act. And somewhere in another forest on another day, another person would find another secret buried by time and choose to bring it to light. Another keeper would take up the oath. Another story would be told. That was the legacy. Not the buildings or the plaques or the laws, though those mattered. The legacy was the choosing, the decision made again and again by different people in different times, that truth was worth protecting, that the dead deserved to be remembered, that the past had something essential to teach the present. Rob finished his wine and set the glass down. Ellen's hand found his in the darkness. Bear's tail thumped once against the porch boards. And in the quiet of that Mississippi evening, with stars overhead and stories all around, Robert Mitchell understood that he was no longer just a man who walked trails and checked maps. He was a keeper. And that was enough. That was everything. The forest kept its secrets, but not all of them. Some secrets were meant to be found. Some promises were meant to be kept. And some stories, like the story of Joseph and Ruth and Clara Harmon, were meant to echo through the years, reminding everyone who heard them that love is stronger than fear, truth is more powerful than lies, and the human spirit, when it chooses courage over comfort, can move mountains. The end was also a beginning, and that, Rob thought, was exactly how it should be.